Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to StoryForge Network. I didn't expect graduation day to feel like a test I hadn't studied for, but not the academic kind, the kind where you realize who shows up when it matters and who only cheers when there's something to gain. I remember the morning clearly, the way sunlight slid across my bedroom floor, the quiet hum of nerves and pride tangling in my chest, the cap and gown hanging from the closet door like proof that all those late nights had counted for something. I checked my phone before I even got out of bed, habit more than hope, scrolling for a message that said, "We're on our way," or "We can't wait to see you." There was nothing new, just the same family group chat buzzing about wings, dips, and kickoff times for the Super Bowl party my parents had been planning for weeks. They'd mentioned it in passing, as if it were a detail, not a decision. "We'll catch the highlights," my mom had said, smiling like it was a compromise. I told myself they'd surprise me. They always liked surprises, just never the kind I needed. I ironed the gown twice, not because it needed it, but because my hands needed something to do. I thought about all the years that led up to that morning, the scholarships I chased, the jobs I worked after classes, the way I learned to measure my worth by grades and grit because praise was rationed at home. Success in my family was expected, not celebrated. You didn't get applause for doing what you were supposed to do. You got silence and sometimes a nod. Still, I hoped. Hope has a way of surviving on scraps. The ceremony hall smelled like flowers and hairspray and nerves. Families filled the rows, some waving handmade signs, others holding balloons that bobbed like bright promises. I found my seat with the other graduates, adjusting my cap and trying to breathe through the tightness in my throat. When the dean spoke, I scanned the crowd again. I saw a grandmother clutching a bouquet too big for her lap. I saw a father with tears running freely down his face. I saw mothers leaning forward, phones raised, eyes shining. I didn't see my parents. I told myself traffic was bad. I told myself parking was a nightmare. I told myself anything that would keep the ache from becoming a scream. My name was called. I stood. The walk felt longer than it should have, every step echoing with the absence I was trying not to feel. I smiled for the camera because that's what you do when you've learned to perform resilience. I shook the dean's hand, took the diploma, and turned toward the crowd one more time, heart thudding, just in case. Nothing. Applause rose and fell like waves, but none of it was for me. Or maybe it was, just not from the people I needed. Afterward, classmates posed with families, laughter spilling everywhere. I stood off to the side, holding my diploma like a fragile thing, and called my parents. It rang until voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I texted instead. "It's over. I graduated." The reply came fast, bright with emojis. "Congrats! The game's starting. We'll talk later." I stared at the screen until it blurred, then slipped my phone into my pocket and walked to my car. The parking lot felt too big, the sky too blue for how small I felt. I drove home alone, the radio off, the gown folded beside me like a question I didn't want to answer. When I walked into the house, the TV was already on at full volume, the living room crowded with neighbors and friends. Laughter erupted as I entered, someone shouting about a touchdown. My mom glanced up and clapped, quick and distracted. "There she is," like I'd just run an errand. My dad raised a beer and a half toast. No hug, no picture, no pause. I slipped the gown over a chair and stood there, invisible, while the game roared on. I felt something settle in my chest then, not anger exactly, but a clarity that felt colder and heavier. "This is who they are," a voice inside me said. "Believe it." Later that night, after the crowd thinned and the confetti on TV stopped falling, my parents finally turned their attention to me. They asked about the ceremony in the way people ask about the weather, polite, detached. I answered with short sentences, careful not to spill the truth all over the living room. I went to bed early, diploma on my desk, cap perched on the lamp like a joke. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it brought dreams of empty seats and echoing applause. The next few days passed in a blur of thank you emails, job applications, and quiet planning. I'd been offered an entry-level position out of state, nothing glamorous but solid, a chance. I hadn't told my parents yet. I wanted to see if they'd ask. They didn't. Instead, they talked about expenses, about a slow month, about how things were tighter than expected. On the third day after graduation, my phone buzzed with a message from my dad. "Hey, could you spot us some money, just until next paycheck?" I read it twice, then a third time, the words rearranging themselves into something ugly and unmistakable. They hadn't shown up for me, but they were comfortable asking me to show up for them. I sat on my bed, diploma still unopened in its folder, and felt the final thread snap. It wasn't just the money, it was the timing, the audacity, the way need had a way of clarifying priorities. I thought about all the times I'd covered my own costs, all the ways I'd learned not to need anything from anyone. I thought about the empty seat with my name on it, and I realized something that would change the shape of my life. Love that only appears when it's convenient isn't love, it's a transaction. I didn't answer right away. I stared at the wall and let the silence do its work. For the first time, I considered what it would mean to say no, not in anger, not in revenge, but in self-respect. I imagined a future where my worth wasn't measured by what I could provide, where my milestones were honored because they mattered, not because they were useful. The idea felt terrifying and freeing at all once. That night, I opened the diploma folder. The paper inside was heavier than I expected, embossed and official, my name spelled correctly at last. I ran my fingers over it and smiled, a real one, small but steady. Whatever came next, I had earned this, and for the first time, I decided earning would be enough. I didn't respond to my dad's message that night. I let it sit there, glowing on my phone like a test I refused to rush through. The next morning, I woke up with a strange calm, the kind that follows a hard truth finally being admitted. Over coffee, I drafted and deleted a dozen replies. Some were sharp, some were apologetic. None felt right. In the end, I typed something simple. I can't help with money right now. I stared at it for a long time before hitting send, my thumb hovering like it might betray me. When the message went through, my chest tightened, then loosened, like I'd finally exhaled after holding my breath for years. The response came quickly. "Wow," my dad wrote, "after everything we've done for you?" I closed my eyes and counted to 10. The list in my head grew longer with each number. The nights I worked late, the scholarships I hunted down, the way I learned to cook for myself because dinner was unpredictable. I didn't argue, I didn't explain. I set the phone face down and finished my coffee. Boundaries, I'd read somewhere, don't need defending, they need respecting. A week later, I accepted the job out of state. When I told my parents, my mom blinked like she hadn't heard me. "So soon?" she asked. "We thought you'd stay a while." I thought of the empty seat, the party noise, the text asking for money. I told her I needed a fresh start. She nodded, distracted, already thinking about logistics. There was no send-off dinner, no speech about being proud, just a casual, drive safe. The move was quiet and efficient. I packed what I owned into boxes and suitcases, each item a small declaration of independence. On my last night, I walked through the house and touched the walls, not out of nostalgia, but to confirm something inside me had already left. In the morning, I loaded the car and pulled away without looking back. The road stretched ahead, wide and anonymous, and for the first time, anonymity felt like relief. The new city didn't greet me with fireworks. It greeted me with paperwork, traffic, and a studio apartment that smelled faintly of paint and hope. I learned the rhythms of my days quickly. Early mornings, late evenings, the comfort of routines that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. Work was demanding but fair. My supervisor noticed effort and said so out loud. The first time she thanked me for staying late, I nearly cried in the break room. It startled me how hungry I was for basic acknowledgement. My parents called occasionally, usually when they needed something, advice about bills, questions about my paycheck. I kept the conversations short and neutral. I didn't volunteer details about my life, not out of spite, but because I was learning that privacy could be a kindness to myself. When my mom asked why I sounded distant, I told her I was busy. It wasn't a lie. Months passed. I made friends who showed up on moving days and birthdays. We celebrated small wins with takeout and laughter. I learned what it felt like to be seen without performing. The ache from graduation dulled, then settled into a scar I could touch without flinching. I started saving, building a cushion that felt like safety. When the holidays came, I didn't go home. I sent a card instead. Then came the call that shifted everything again. It was my mom, voice tight with worry. They were behind on rent, an unexpected expense. Could I help just this once? I felt the old pull, the reflex to rescue. I asked a question instead. "Did you watch my graduation?" Silence stretched. "We meant to," she said finally. I swallowed. "I can't send money right now," I replied, my voice steady. "I hope things work out." I hung up and sat on the floor until the shaking stopped. The guilt came later, heavy and insistent. I talked it through with a friend who listened without judgment. "You're not responsible for their choices. You're responsible for yours." That night, I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that follows alignment. A year after graduation, I got a promotion. I took myself out to dinner and toasted quietly to the person I was becoming. I thought about calling my parents. I didn't. I posted a photo instead. Nothing flashy. My mom commented with a heart. My dad sent a thumbs up. It was enough. When we did finally talk about graduation, it happened by accident, in a longer call than usual. My mom said she wished she'd done things differently. My dad apologized, awkward and brief. I thanked them and said I was doing well. I didn't reopen the wound to prove it existed. Some apologies aren't invitations to revisit pain. They're acknowledgments that let you move on. I learned, slowly, that forgiveness doesn't mean access. It means releasing the hope that the past could be different. It means choosing peace over proof. I kept my boundaries, not as punishment, but as protection. When my parents asked for money again, I said no again. When they asked how work was going, I answered honestly, but briefly. Our relationship found a new shape, smaller and safer. On the anniversary of my graduation, I took the diploma out and framed it. I hung it where I could see it every morning, not as a reminder of who didn't show up, but of who did, me. I stood there one morning, coffee in hand, and felt proud in a way that didn't need witnesses. The lesson I carried forward was simple and hard-won. Showing up matters, and absence teaches. I couldn't change my parents' priorities, but I could change my own. I could invest my time and care where it was returned, and I could stop auditioning for love that came with conditions. My life grew quieter, steadier, richer in ways I hadn't been taught to value. Sometimes, late at night, the memory still flickered, the empty seat, the roar of a crowd that wasn't mine. I let it pass. I had built something solid out of that absence, something no party could drown out. And now, when my phone buzzed, it was more often a friend checking in than a parent asking for help. That felt like progress. The second year after graduation taught me how quiet growth can be. There were no dramatic turning points, no speeches or reconciliations, just the steady accumulation of days where I chose myself without making a production of it. I learned the bus routes, the shortcuts through side streets that smelled like bakeries in the morning, the coffee shop where the barista remembered my name. I learned that independence isn't loud. It's a series of small promises you keep to yourself. Work expanded in ways I hadn't anticipated. I was given projects that stretched me, asked to lead meetings I once would have dreaded. Each time I spoke up, I felt the old trimmer. What if I disappoint someone? And each time I answered it with preparation and honesty. When feedback came, it was specific and fair. No moving goalposts, no silence masquerading as expectation. The contrast to home was stark enough to make me grieve what I hadn't had, even as I celebrated what I was building. My parents stayed on the periphery of my life, present enough to remind me of their existence, distant enough to avoid real intimacy. We exchanged holiday greetings and updates about the weather. Occasionally, my mom would ask if I was dating anyone, as if a relationship could stand in for connection. I'd answer lightly and change the subject. There were moments I wondered if I was being cold. Then I remembered the night of the Super Bowl, the sound of cheering over my own quiet disappointment, and the clarity returned. I started therapy that year, not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to understand the shape of the wound before it decided how I'd move. In that room, with its neutral walls and ticking clock, I said things out loud that had lived in me for years. I learned the language for what I'd felt: emotional neglect, conditional support, parentification. Words didn't excuse what happened, but they gave me a map. The therapist asked what I wanted from my parents now. I thought carefully. Consistency, I said. Respect, and to stop being asked to fill gaps I didn't create. She nodded and wrote it down like it was reasonable. That mattered more than I expected. Around the same time, my parents' requests changed tone. They weren't just asking for money anymore, they were asking for a reassurance. "Are you mad at us?" my mom asked once. I considered the question. "I'm not angry," I said. "I'm careful." It was the truest answer I had. Careful with my time, my energy, my hope. The call that forced everything into the open came on an ordinary Tuesday. My dad's voice sounded smaller, edged with embarrassment. He told me about a setback, a series of choices catching up all at once. He asked if I could help, just a little, to get them through. I felt the familiar tug, the child in me stepping forward with a solution. I breathed and asked what help would look like beyond money. Silence again. "We don't really know," he said. I told him I could help them make a plan, look at options, but I couldn't send cash. The disappointment was immediate and sharp. "So that's it?" he asked. "You're done with us?" I swallowed. "No," I said. "I'm done being your backup plan." We didn't talk for a while after that. I wondered if I'd gone too far. Therapy helped me sit with the discomfort. Boundaries, I learned, often feel unkind to people who benefited from your lack of them. The guilt ebbed and flowed, but it didn't steer me anymore. That summer, I took a trip I'd always postponed. I stood by the ocean and let the wind tangle my hair, watching waves repeat a pattern older than my family's mistakes. I thought about how often I'd waited for permission to live fully, to celebrate myself. I wrote my parents a postcard, brief and neutral. I didn't mention the ocean's power or the way I cried on the shore. Some things were mine. When I got back, a letter waited in my mailbox. It was from my mom, handwritten, the paper creased like it had been folded and unfolded many times. She apologized more fully than she ever had, acknowledging the graduation, the party, the money requests. She didn't excuse it, she named it. I read it twice, then a third time, and felt something soften. Not everything, but enough. I called her the next day. We talked quietly. I told her what I needed going forward. She listened. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Over the next months, we practiced a new rhythm. My parents stopped asking for money. They asked questions instead, about my work, my friends, the city. Sometimes they slipped into old patterns, but when I pointed it out, they corrected course. Change, I realized, is often awkward and slow. It doesn't erase the past, it reshapes the present. On the anniversary of the Super Bowl that changed everything, my dad called. "I should have been there," he said. "I was wrong." I thanked him. I didn't add anything else. The space after an apology can be sacred. You don't have to fill it. As my life continued to widen, I felt less defined by what I'd lacked. I hosted dinners in my small apartment, laughed loudly, planned for the future without checking if it was allowed. I set aside money for goals that mattered to me. I learned that pride can be quiet too, something you carry rather than display. One evening, a friend asked if I'd go to a graduation with her cousin whose parents couldn't attend. I said yes without hesitation. I sat in the crowd and clapped until my hands hurt. When the graduate crossed the stage and searched for faces, I waved, beaming. The moment felt like a circle closing, not with bitterness, but with intention. We don't always get the family we need. Sometimes we become it. The story I tell myself now is different. It doesn't center on the party or the ask for money. It centers on the choice I made afterward to build a life that didn't require permission or payment. I learned to show up for myself first, and in doing so, I became available for others in healthier ways. When my parents visit now, we meet on my terms. We talk, we laugh, we don't pretend the past didn't happen, we also don't let it dictate the present. It's a balance I maintain carefully, like carrying something fragile but valuable. I framed another photo and hung it near my diploma. It's from that ocean trip, the horizon wide and calm. It reminds me that there's always more beyond the room you're standing in, even when the door feels closed. Especially then. The second year after graduation taught me how quiet growth can be. There were no dramatic turning points, no speeches or reconciliations, just the steady accumulation of days where I chose myself without making a production of it. I learned the bus routes, the shortcuts through side streets that smelt like bakeries in the morning, the coffee shop where the barista remembered my name. I learned that independence isn't loud. It's a series of small promises you keep to yourself. Work expanded in ways I hadn't anticipated. I was given projects that stretched me, asked to lead meetings I once would have dreaded. Each time I spoke up, I felt the old tremor. What if I disappoint someone? And each time I answered it with preparation and honesty. When feedback came, it was specific and fair. No moving goalposts, no silence masquerading as expectation. The contrast to home was stark enough to make me grieve what I hadn't had, even as I celebrated what I was building. My parents stayed on the periphery of my life, present enough to remind me of their existence, distant enough to avoid real intimacy. We exchanged holiday greetings and updates about the weather. Occasionally, my mom would ask if I was dating anyone, as if a relationship could stand in for connection. I'd answer lightly and change the subject. There were moments I wondered if I was being cold. Then I remembered the night of the Super Bowl, the sound of cheering over my own quiet disappointment, and the clarity returned. I started therapy that year, not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to understand the shape of the wound before it decided how I'd move. In that room, with its neutral walls and ticking clock, I said things out loud that had lived in me for years. I learned the language for what I'd felt: emotional neglect, conditional support, parentification. Words didn't excuse what happened, but they gave me a map. The therapist asked what I wanted from my parents now. I thought carefully. Consistency, I said, respect, and to stop being asked to fill gaps I didn't create. She nodded and wrote it down like it was reasonable. That mattered more than I expected. Around the same time, my parents' requests changed tone. They weren't just asking for money anymore. They were asking for reassurance. "Are you mad at us?" my mom asked once. I considered the question. "I'm not angry," I said. "I'm careful." It was the truest answer I had. careful with my time, my energy, my hope. The call that forced everything into the open came on an ordinary Tuesday. My dad's voice sounded smaller, edged with embarrassment. He told me about a setback, a series of choices catching up all at once. He asked if I could help a bit to get them through. I felt the familiar tug, the child in me stepping forward with a solution. I breathed and asked what help would look like beyond money. Silence again. "We don't really know," he said. I told him I could help them make a plan, look at options, but I couldn't send cash. The disappointment was immediate and sharp. "So that's it? You're done with us?" I swallowed. "No," I said. "I'm done being your backup plan." We didn't talk for a while after that. I wondered if I'd gone too far. Therapy helped me sit with the discomfort. Boundaries, I learned, often feel unkind to people who benefited from your lack of them. The guilt ebbed and flowed, but it didn't steer me anymore. That summer, I took a trip I'd always postponed. I stood by the ocean and let the wind tangle my hair, watching waves repeat a pattern older than my family's mistakes. I thought about how often I'd waited for permission to live fully, to celebrate myself. I wrote my parents a postcard, brief and neutral. I didn't mention the ocean's power or the way I cried on the shore. Some things were mine. When I got back, a letter waited in my mailbox. It was from my mom, handwritten, the paper creased like it had been folded and unfolded many times. She apologized more fully than she ever had, acknowledging the graduation, the party, the money requests. She didn't excuse it. She named it. I read it twice, then a third time, and felt something soften. Not everything, but enough. I called her the next day. We talked quietly. I told her what I needed going forward. She listened. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Over the next months, we practiced a new rhythm. My parents stopped asking for money. They asked questions instead, about my work, my friends, the city. Sometimes they slipped into old patterns, but when I pointed it out, they corrected course. Change, I realized, is often awkward and slow. It doesn't erase the past, it reshapes the present. On the anniversary of the Super Bowl that changed everything, my dad called. I should have been there. I was wrong. I thanked him. I didn't add anything else. The space after an apology can be sacred. You don't have to fill it. As my life continued to widen, I felt less defined by what I'd lacked. I hosted dinners in my small apartment, laughed loudly, planned for the future without checking if it was allowed. I set aside money for goals that mattered to me. I learned that pride can be quiet too, something you carry rather than display. One evening, a friend asked if I'd go to a graduation with her cousin whose parents couldn't attend. I said yes without hesitation. I sat in the crowd and clapped until my hands hurt. When the graduate crossed the stage and searched for faces, I waved, beaming. The moment felt like a circle closing, not with bitterness, but with intention. We don't always get the family we need. Sometimes we become it. The story I tell myself now is different. It doesn't center on the party or the ask for money. It centers on the choice I made afterward, to build a life that didn't require permission or payment. I learned to show up for myself first, and in doing so, I became available for others in healthier ways. When my parents visit now, we meet on my terms. We talk, we laugh. We don't pretend the past didn't happen. We also don't let it dictate the present. It's a balance I maintain carefully, like carrying something fragile but valuable. I framed another photo and hung it near my diploma. It's from that ocean trip, the horizon wide and calm. It reminds me that there's always more beyond the room you're standing in, even when the door feels closed. Especially then. The years that followed smoothed the sharpest edges without erasing their outlines. Life has a way of doing that when you stop fighting it and start listening. I settled into a pace that felt sustainable. Ambitious but humane. Mornings began with quiet routines I protected fiercely. Evenings were for cooking, reading, or long walks that let the day loosen its grip. I stopped mistaking busyness for worth. My relationship with my parents continued in its new shape. We spoke regularly, not constantly. They asked before offering advice. I declined when it didn't fit. When old habits surfaced, an offhand comment about money, a hint of expectation, I named it calmly. They corrected themselves more often than not. The work of repair, I learned, isn't grand. It's repetitive. It's choosing the better response again and again. A call came one winter that tested that repair. My mom was anxious, her voice threaded with urgency. A financial decision had gone wrong. She didn't ask for money this time. She asked for help, thinking. We spread papers across a table over video chat, talked through options, made a plan that didn't rely on me as a bank. When we finished, she exhaled. "Thank you," she said, "for not taking over." I smiled. "Thank you for not asking me to." Work brought new challenges and new confidence. I mentored a junior colleague who reminded me of myself, capable, hesitant, hungry for approval. I praised her specifically and often. I watched her stand taller over time. It felt like paying something forward, not to my parents, but to the world that had caught me when they didn't. I bought my first home that year. It was modest and sunlit, with a door that closed quietly behind me. On moving day, friends arrived with boxes and jokes. My parents sent a plant. I placed it near the window and watered it carefully, amused by the metaphor and grateful for it. We hosted dinner a few months later. My parents came early, brought dessert, asked where to put their coats. The evening was warm, unforced. At one point, my dad looked around and said, "You did this." I nodded. The acknowledgement landed without weight. Sometimes alone, I revisited the memory of graduation, not to punish myself, but to honor the pivot it created. Pain had pointed me toward a life that fit. Without it, I might have stayed smaller, quieter, waiting. I don't romanticize hurt, but I respect what it can catalyze when you refuse to let it define you. When the Super Bowl came around again, my parents invited me to watch with them. I declined and went to a friend's place instead. It wasn't spite, it was preference. Later, my mom texted to ask how my night was. I told her it was good. It was true. The story I carry now has room for nuance. My parents are flawed and learning. I am healed and still healing. The money that once symbolized imbalance no longer has that power. We talk openly about expectations. We check in. We apologize. We move on. On the 5th anniversary of my graduation, I attended a ceremony as a guest speaker at a local college. I told a room full of graduates that success is quieter than it looks and sturdier than it feels. I told them to pay attention to who shows up, including themselves. Afterward, a student hugged me and said, "I needed that." So did I. That night, I called my parents. We talked about ordinary things. When we hung up, I sat in my living room, the plant by the window casting a long shadow, and felt something like peace settle in. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of choice. Time kept moving, as it always does, but I noticed how differently it moved when I wasn't bracing for impact. Days felt longer in a good way. I wasn't rushing toward milestones to prove anything. I was inhabiting them. When you stop chasing validation, you discover how much energy you've been burning just to be seen. My parents and I developed a rhythm that felt adult in the truest sense, not equal in history, but equal in agency. We shared holidays without tension, conversations without landmines. If something felt off, I said it. If they slipped into old patterns, they caught themselves faster than I expected. Growth doesn't erase the past, but it can reframe it into something usable. Then came the call I'd half expected and half dreaded. It was my dad, quieter than usual, a health scare. Not immediate danger, but enough to shake certainty. I flew home the next morning, suitcase light, boundaries intact. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights hummed, and the waiting chairs remembered too many stories. I sat between my parents, aware of the echo of an old wish to be chosen first. This time I didn't need it. We talked in measured tones. The doctor explained options. I listened, asked questions, took notes. My mom squeezed my hand. It was reflexive, tender. I let it be that without making it mean more than it did. Care doesn't have to be transactional to be real. Afterward, back at the house, my parents hovered the way parents do when they're scared. I helped with practical things. I cooked, I cleaned, I didn't fix. When money came up, it was framed differently. They had a plan. They asked my opinion, not my wallet. I offered clarity and calm. They thanked me. We moved on. That night I slept in my childhood room. The walls held posters and memories I'd outgrown. I felt no pull to become who I'd been there. Instead, I felt grateful to have left and grateful to be able to return without shrinking. In the weeks that followed, my dad recovered steadily. The crisis receded, leaving behind a gentler awareness of time. We spoke more often for a while, then less, then found a middle ground again. I returned to my life with a renewed sense of its shape. I wasn't the child who left with a suitcase and a silence. I was an adult who chose proximity without surrender. Work evolved too. I turned down a promotion that would have required sacrificing the routines that kept me grounded. The decision surprised people. It didn't surprise me. Success, I'd learned, is alignment. I took on a different role that valued mentorship and strategy over endless hours. It paid well enough. It paid me back better. A friend asked once if I'd forgiven my parents. I paused. Forgiveness had felt like a finish line once. Now it felt like a practice. Some days were easier than others. What mattered was that forgiveness no longer required my erasure. I could hold compassion and boundaries at the same time. On a quiet Sunday, I found my graduation gown folded in a box. I'd kept it without knowing why. I took it out, let the fabric fall open, noticed how light it felt now. I didn't resent it. I didn't mourn it. I packed it away again, not as a wound, but as a marker. Here is where the turn happened. I began speaking more openly about my story, not to accuse, but to offer language. People told me it helped them name their own quiet disappointments. Naming, I realized, is power. It turns fog into terrain. My parents attended one of my talks. I didn't know they would. When I saw them in the back row, I felt a flicker of nerves, then steadiness. I spoke honestly, kindly, without editing my truth to manage their feelings. Afterward, my mom hugged me. My dad said, "We missed that day." I nodded. "You did." There was no sting in it, just fact. We went for coffee. We talked about the future. We talked about the weather. We talked about nothing. It was enough. As the year closed, I reflected on how the story had changed me. I had learned to leave when staying required silence. I had learned to return when returning didn't cost me myself. I had learned that love can be rebuilt without pretending the cracks weren't there. I don't measure my life against the moment they skipped anymore. I measure it by the moments I show up for myself, by the mornings that begin quietly, by the evenings that end with gratitude, by the choices that keep my peace intact. The Super Bowl came and went again. I barely noticed. I used to think the hardest part of growing up was learning how to survive without the things you didn't get. Turns out, the harder part is learning how to live well after you finally do. When the noise quiets down, when the crisis passes, when nobody is actively disappointing you anymore, that's when you're left alone with yourself, and that's where the real work begins. After my parents attended that talk, something subtle shifted inside me. Not because they showed up, though that mattered, but because I didn't rearrange my truth to make the moment easier. I let my words land where they landed. I didn't rush to soothe. I didn't apologize for the weight of my own story. That was new, and it felt like standing upright after years of hunching. Life settled into a rhythm that felt earned. Mornings with coffee and intention, work days that challenged me without hollowing me out, evenings where silence felt companionable instead of lonely. I started volunteering on weekends, mentoring students who reminded me of myself at 18, eager, uncertain, brilliant, and terrified of being invisible. I never told them my whole story. I didn't need to. I showed them what it looked like to take yourself seriously. My parents and I kept our careful balance. We spoke every few weeks, sometimes more, sometimes less. There were no dramatic confrontations left, no overdue confessions waiting in the wings, just the ongoing practice of being honest without being cruel. They asked about my work. I asked about their garden. We laughed more than I expected. We didn't pretend the past had been perfect. We didn't rehearse it either. Then, late one evening, my mom called. Her voice carried a familiar tremor, but this time it wasn't fear. It was hesitation. She told me they were thinking about downsizing, about selling the house. The house, the place that had held my childhood and my leaving. She asked how I felt about it. I surprised myself by answering calmly. I told her the truth, that the house was important but not sacred, that memories live in people, not walls, that whatever they decided, I trusted myself to be okay. There was a pause on the line, thick with something like relief, maybe grief, maybe gratitude, maybe both. A week later, my dad called too. He told me he'd found an old photo from my graduation day. It was just me standing in my cap and gown, smiling a little too hard. He said he'd kept it in his wallet all these years. I let the silence stretch. I didn't know what he wanted me to say, so I said what felt true. I'm glad you have it. We didn't unpack it further. We didn't need to. Some truths don't ask to be explained, they ask to be acknowledged. Around that time, I faced a decision of my own. An opportunity had come up, an offer to move cities again, this time for a leadership role that aligned with everything I'd been building. It meant distance from my parents, not estrangement, just geography. The old version of me would have felt guilty for wanting it. This version felt clarity. I told my parents over dinner. My mom's eyes glistened, but she smiled. My dad nodded and asked practical questions. They told me they were proud. I noticed how that word landed now. It didn't inflate me. It didn't heal me. It warmed me briefly and then passed. I thanked them. We ordered dessert. The move was quiet, no dramatic send-off. A few boxes, a last look around my apartment. I left behind routines and carried forward habits. In the new city, I built a life piece by piece. A favorite cafe, a walking path by the river, colleagues who respected my time, friends who didn't need explanations. One night, unpacking the last box, I found that graduation gown again. I laughed out loud. I hadn't meant to bring it. I held it up, remembering the weight it once carried. Then I folded it carefully and donated it the next day. Not because I was done with it, but because I didn't need to keep proof of a turning point to honor it. I began to understand something that had eluded me for years. Closure isn't a conversation you have with someone else. It's a relationship you make with yourself. It's the moment you stop asking different questions of the same wound. It's choosing peace without demanding an apology first. My parents visited once in the new city. We walked along the river, we talked about small things and big things. There was no reckoning waiting to happen, just the shared understanding that we were all doing the best we could with the tools we had, then and now. As they left, my mom hugged me a little longer than usual. She said, "You built a good life." I believed her. More importantly, I believed myself. That night, alone in my apartment, I thought about the kid I'd been, the one who waited in a cap and gown watching the clock, learning a hard lesson about priorities. I wished I could tell them this, that the hurt wouldn't be the end of the story, that leaving would teach them how to stay with themselves, that one skipped moment wouldn't define them, their choices afterward would. If you're listening to this and carrying a disappointment that still feels heavy, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't have to minimize your pain to move forward. You don't have to harden to survive. You can choose yourself without abandoning love. You can forgive without forgetting. You can build something steady on the other side of what broke you. My parents missed my graduation. That was true. But they didn't miss my life, and neither did I. There's a strange quiet that comes after you realize you're no longer waiting for something to happen. No phone call you're bracing for, no apology you're rehearsing in your head, no version of the past you're still trying to rewrite. It's not loud like relief. It's not dramatic like closure. It's softer than that. It's the sound of acceptance settling into your bones. In the months after my parents' visit, my life didn't suddenly turn into some perfect picture. There were still long days, still moments of doubt, still nights where exhaustion crept in and whispered old fears. But those fears didn't get the final word anymore. They showed up like distant echoes, not commands. I stopped measuring my worth by how visible I was to people who had once overlooked me. I stopped explaining my choices like they needed to be justified. I noticed how much energy that freed up, how much space it made for joy that didn't have to be earned through struggle. One afternoon, while walking home from work, I passed a university campus buzzing with graduation week energy. Caps tossed into the air, parents holding bouquets, cameras flashing. For a moment, my chest tightened the way it used to. Then something unexpected happened. I smiled. Not a bitter smile, not a forced one, a genuine, quiet smile. I realized I wasn't mourning my graduation anymore. I was honoring the person who walked away afterward and chose to keep going anyway. That night, I pulled out a journal I hadn't touched in years. I flipped through old entries filled with anger, confusion, and desperate questions. Why wasn't I enough? Why did they choose something else? Why did it hurt this much? I didn't judge those words. I thanked them. They had carried me through a season I didn't know how to survive any other way. Then I wrote something new. I wrote about who I had become, someone steady, someone capable of loving without shrinking, someone who understood that being chosen starts with choosing yourself. My relationship with my parents continued as it was, imperfect, respectful, bounded. They never asked me for money again. I don't know if that was growth, pride, or understanding, maybe all three. I didn't analyze it. I didn't need to. On my birthday that year, they sent a card. Inside, my dad had written a single line. We should have shown up better back then. I'm trying now. It wasn't poetic, it wasn't long, but it was honest, and that mattered. I called them to say thank you. We talked about ordinary things, the weather, a new recipe my mom was trying, a neighbor they didn't like very much. When we hung up, I noticed something else. I wasn't emotionally drained. I wasn't buzzing with unresolved feelings. I was just fine. That was when it truly hit me. Healing doesn't announce itself. It sneaks up on you in moments like that. I started speaking occasionally at community events, sharing pieces of my story, not for sympathy, but for connection. People came up to me afterward, eyes shining, voices shaking, saying they had lived something similar. A missed milestone, a parent who didn't show up, a moment that changed everything. I listened more than I talked. I told them what I wish someone had told me sooner, that your life doesn't pause waiting for someone else to recognize your worth. It keeps moving, and you get to decide how. One evening, after one of those talks, I sat alone by the river again, the same path, different version of me. I thought about the one-way ticket I bought all those years ago, how terrifying it felt, how lonely, how necessary. That ticket wasn't just a way out, it was a way in, into adulthood on my own terms, into resilience I didn't know I possessed, into a future that didn't depend on being approved. My parents didn't attend my graduation. That truth will always exist, but it no longer defines the relationship I have with myself, and that, I've learned, is the relationship that shapes everything else. If there's one thing I hope stays with you from my story, it's this. Disappointment can either shrink you or sharpen you. You don't get to choose what hurts you, but you do get to choose what you build afterward. I didn't build my life out of revenge. I didn't build it to prove anything. I built it because I deserved a life that felt whole, even if it started with being left out of a room I should have mattered in. Sometimes love fails us. Sometimes family does too. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop waiting at the door and start walking towards yourself.
If I'm being honest, the ending of a story like this never really ends. It just grows quieter, softer, until it becomes part of the background hum of your life instead of the loudest sound in the room. Even now, years later, I still notice how that one decision, buying a one-way ticket after my graduation, keeps revealing new meanings. At first, I thought it was an act of escape, a clean break, a way to prove I didn't need anyone who could choose a party over me. But with time, I understood something gentler and more complicated. It wasn't about leaving my parents behind. It was about leaving behind the version of myself who believed love had to be begged for. I learned this lesson slowly, through ordinary days, through paying bills without calling home for advice, through celebrating promotions with friends who had become family, through sitting alone in my apartment on quiet Sundays and realizing I wasn't lonely, I was at peace. There were moments, of course, when the old ache tried to resurface. A coworker talking about how their parents never missed a single milestone, a social media post of a proud family posing together at a graduation ceremony. Those moments still stung, but they didn't spiral. They passed through me instead of taking residence. That's one of the things no one tells you about healing. It doesn't erase the pain. It teaches you how to carry it without letting it carry you. My parents and I eventually found a rhythm that worked. Not the kind you see in movies. No big Sunday dinners every week. No dramatic speeches about forgiveness. Just small, consistent gestures. A check-in call. A shared laugh over something mundane. Respecting each other's limits. I stopped waiting for them to become the parents I needed at 18. They stopped pretending the past hadn't happened. That middle ground was fragile, but it was real. Once, my mother asked me if I ever regretted leaving so suddenly. The question hung between us, heavy and careful. I thought about it before answering. I told her the truth. I said I regretted that it had been necessary, but I didn't regret choosing myself. She nodded. She didn't argue, and in that quiet nod, I felt more understood than I had in years. What surprised me most was how that choice shaped my relationships afterward. I no longer stayed where I felt unseen. I no longer over-explained my boundaries. I no longer mistook inconsistency for love. When people showed me who they were, I believed them the first time. That didn't make me harder, it made me clearer. I began mentoring younger students who reminded me of myself, bright, driven, and quietly unsure if they mattered enough to be celebrated. I showed up for their milestones when I could. I clapped loudly, I took photos, I told them I was proud. Not because I was trying to fix my past, but because presence matters more than people realize. Sometimes they'd ask me how I got so independent. I'd smile and say, independence wasn't something I was born with. It was something I learned when I realized no one was coming to hand it to me. Every now and then, I'd see a Super Bowl commercial or hear people joking about missing important things for a game. I never laughed. I never got angry either. I just felt distant from it, like it belonged to a different life. Because the truth is, that day stopped being about what my parents chose. It became about what I chose next. I chose not to let that disappointment define my ceiling. I chose not to let resentment rot something inside me. I chose growth over grudges, clarity over chaos, and self-respect over longing. And yes, my parents did ask me for money once, not long after that graduation. They were struggling. They were embarrassed. And in that moment, I realized how much power I actually had. Not power over them, but power over myself. I could say yes or no without fear of abandonment because I had already survived it. I helped them in a way that didn't hurt me. I set limits. I didn't sacrifice my stability to soothe their discomfort. And afterward, I didn't feel used. I felt steady. That's when I knew the cycle had truly broken. If you're listening to this and you're standing at your own crossroads, feeling overlooked or taken for granted, I want you to hear this clearly. You are allowed to choose yourself without becoming cold. You are allowed to move forward without carrying everyone with you. You are allowed to build a life that doesn't require anyone else's permission. Some people will miss your milestones. Some will realize their mistakes too late. Some will only see your value once you stop offering it freely. That doesn't make you unlovable. It makes you human. The day my parents skipped my graduation felt like an ending. Looking back now, I see it for what it really was, a beginning I didn't ask for, but one that taught me how to stand on my own feet. I didn't get the celebration I deserved that day, but I gave myself a life that honors who I am, and that, in the end, has meant more than any applause ever could.
There's a quiet moment that comes after every long journey, when you stop walking and finally look back at the road behind you. Not to punish yourself with regret, but to understand how far you've actually come. For me, that moment didn't arrive with fireworks or applause. It arrived one evening as I stood in my kitchen, barefoot, watching the sun dip below the buildings outside my window, realizing that my life finally felt like it belonged to me. I used to think closure came from conversations, from apologies spoken the right way, from parents suddenly understanding everything they failed to see. But life taught me something far more honest. Closure comes from no longer needing those things to move forward. After my parents asked me for money all those years ago, our relationship changed again. Not dramatically, just subtly. The imbalance I'd felt my whole life, the sense that I was always reaching while they were always deciding, was gone. I wasn't a child hoping to be chosen anymore. I was an adult who chose. We still spoke, we still checked in, but the conversations had edges now, clear ones. I didn't rush to fill silences. I didn't explain myself into exhaustion. If something didn't feel right, I said so, and if it stayed wrong, I stepped back without guilt. That was new for me, and freeing. I started marking my own milestones the way I wished someone had done for me. When I reached career goals, I took myself out to dinner. When I signed my first lease on a place that felt like home, I sat on the floor with takeout and let myself feel proud. When life felt heavy, I rested without apologizing. Slowly, the voice in my head that once asked, "Am I enough?" grew quieter. In its place came another voice, steadier and kinder, saying, "You always were." There was one last moment with my parents that sealed everything for me. A visit during the holidays, years after that graduation. We were sitting at the table, coffee growing cold, when my father mentioned the Super Bowl in passing. He laughed casually and said, "Hard to believe we missed your graduation for that." He expected me to laugh too. I didn't. I didn't get angry either. I just looked at him and said calmly, "It changed my life." The room went quiet. My mother looked down at her cup. My father nodded slowly, like he was finally letting the weight of that sentence land.
No excuses followed, no defenses, just silence. And strangely, that was enough. Because by then, I didn't need them to feel the same pain I once did. I didn't need them to undo it. I had already done the work myself. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Abandonment doesn't always look like someone leaving physically. Sometimes it's choosing everything else over you again and again until you learn to choose yourself just to survive. And survival, when done long enough, turns into strength. Today, my life isn't perfect, it's real, it's grounded, it's filled with people who show up not because they're supposed to, but because they want to. I've built a version of family that understands presence is the loudest form of love. When I think back to that younger version of myself, standing in a cap and gown, scanning the crowd and coming up empty, I don't feel sadness the way I used to. I feel compassion, pride, gratitude. That moment broke something open inside me that needed to be broken. It taught me that being overlooked doesn't make you invisible. It makes you aware. And awareness changes everything. So if you're listening to this and you're carrying a quiet hurt from a moment no one else seems to remember, know this. The people who missed your milestones don't get to define your worth. The choices you make afterward do. Sometimes the greatest gift life gives you is the push you never wanted toward a life you didn't know you were strong enough to build. I didn't get my parents' applause that day, but I found my own voice, and I learned how to listen to it. That was the real graduation.